All right, so we're diving deep into Canadian history today.
Sounds exciting.
It is, actually. We've got these excerpts from historyofcanada.pdf, and let me tell you, it's a wild ride. Millennia, we're talking, like ancient indigenous civilizations.
Wow.
Yeah, and then, of course, Europeans showing up and everything changing.
Right. Canada's got such a layered history, so many different influences coming together. It's fascinating how those historical threads, they still kind of weave their way into Canada today. You can see it everywhere.
Exactly. Okay, so let's rewind all the way back. Way back. Before European arrival, the indigenous peoples who were here for, thousands of years, thousands. The document mentions these archaeological digs, right? They found evidence of civilizations that go back centuries.
It's incredible, isn't it?
It is. It just makes you wonder what their lives were like, what stories they could tell.
Yeah, it's important to remember we're talking about so many different societies, not just one big group, the Algonquian, the Iroquoian, the Inuit, each one with their own languages, traditions, ways of life.
Oh, absolutely. Like, take the Iroquoian Confederacy, for example.
Right.
They had this advanced political structure seriously ahead of their time. And their influence, it stretched over huge parts of what's now Southern Ontario and Quebec.
Amazing.
It is. And the document really stresses how important those oral traditions are for understanding these cultures. It's not just about digging up artifacts, It's about listening to those stories, those songs, the teachings passed down through generations.
Absolutely.
It's like a window into their beliefs, their relationship with the land, even how they moved across the continent.
You're totally right. Those oral histories give you a perspective that's just not there in written records. It reminds us that history is about people, real people, their lives, their worldviews.
Okay, so you've got this tapestry of cultures, centuries of history, and then, boom, around the year 1000, the Vikings, they show up.
Who doesn't love a good Viking story?
Right. The document talks about L'Anse aux Meadows, this Viking settlement they found in Newfoundland.
L'Anse aux Meadows is so cool.
Isn't it? It's a real tangible connection to those early explorers crossing the Atlantic way before Columbus even thought about it.
Way before. It's like proof that even back then, the world was more connected than we sometimes realize. And it kind of sets the scene for what's coming next, that wave of Europeans that would change everything.
Exactly. And that brings us to 1497. John Cabot enters the picture, plants the flag for England. There's some debate about exactly where he landed. The document mentions it.
Right.
But no matter where it was a turning point. It was like game on for European powers trying to carve up North America.
Totally. And that's where the real drama starts. You've got the French, you've got the British, both with these huge ambitions, trade, territory, they want it all. And they end up locked in this power struggle that would last for, centuries.
Centuries, yeah. Think about those early French settlements, like Quebec City.
Founded by Samuel de Champlain in 1608.
Exactly. And they were more than just little outposts. They were these flashpoints, the beginning of this massive conflict that would shape the future of Canada. And then you can't forget about the fur trade. It explodes, right? Becomes this huge economic engine for the whole region.
Beavers and pelts galore.
Right. But it was way more than just beavers and pelts. It really impacted the relationships between the Europeans and the indigenous peoples.
Oh, it definitely did. The fur trade created this whole web of alliances, rivalries, everything. On one hand, some indigenous groups saw economic opportunities. But then on the other hand, you've got the spread of new diseases. Competition for resources just got way more intense. And a lot of indigenous communities were displaced.
Yeah. It shows you that progress, it's not always what it seems, often comes with the dark side. And the document doesn't shy away from that dark side. It talks about the French and Iroquois wars, decades of just brutal fighting. And then there's the expulsion of the Acadians in 1755.
Le Grand Déménagement, a really dark chapter.
It is. Thousands of Acadians forced out of their homes. It's a story that still resonates in Canada today.
It's a reminder that these weren't just abstract battles, We're talking about real people, families torn apart, communities scattered to the wind. The Acadian expulsion especially, it just highlights the human cost of all this colonial ambition. It makes you think about history differently, doesn't it?
It does. It makes you think. So now we're moving into the 18th century, and we see another huge shift, 1763, the Treaty of Paris. Canada transitions to British rule. It's a whole new chapter in the Canadian story.
A big one.
Yeah, it must have been a tough transition for the French-speaking population. Suddenly, everything's different. New rules, new culture, new power dynamics.
Definitely. It was a challenge, for sure. But you also start to see some guarantees of religious and legal rights for French Canadians, the Quebec Act of 1774, for example. It was an attempt, at least, to recognize their distinct identity.
Right. And then, boom, you've got all these loyalists fleeing the American Revolution, heading north. Talk about a culture clash.
It was a huge influx of people.
It really solidified Canada's ties to the British Crown. And it set the stage for a very different path compared to the U.S. Yeah.
Totally different. And the arrival of those loyalists had a ripple effect, led to the creation of new provinces, amplified those existing tensions between Republican and monarchist ideals. And, sadly, it led to further displacement of indigenous populations as these new settlers sought land and resources.
Yeah. It's like you can see how these events, way back then, planted the seeds for issues that are still relevant in Canada today.
Absolutely. The echoes of history are everywhere.
They are. And just to add fuel to the fire, you have the War of 1812. No boundaries changed or anything, but it really solidified that sense of a distinct Canadian identity.
It did, didn't it?
Yeah, it seems like every obstacle, every conflict just pushed Canada further down its own unique path.
That's a great way to put it. Even though the War of 1812 didn't have a clear winner, militarily speaking, it had a huge impact on how Canadians saw themselves. It created this sense of vulnerability, but also this fierce determination to protect their land, their way of life.
Yeah.
It's almost like you see this theme emerging, this idea of a nation forged in adversity, being tested and coming out stronger. And, speaking of resilience, we can't forget the rebellions of 1837. These uprisings, they happened in both Upper and Lower Canada. They showed just how much frustration there was with British rule. There was this growing desire for, Canadians to govern themselves.
It is fascinating, though, how those rebellions, even though they failed, they really sparked change. The document talks about the Durham Report, right?
Oh, yeah.
It recommended responsible government for Canada. That was huge.
Absolutely. The Durham Report, it was controversial back then, but it really did lay the groundwork for a more autonomous Canada.
Right.
It acknowledged that the colonists had legitimate grievances and then said, hey, the government should be accountable to the people it represents. Big step towards the Canada we know today.
It is. And at the same time as all this political turmoil, Canada's also seeing this wave of immigration.
Right.
Almost 1 million people arrived from the British Isles, between the Napoleonic Wars in 1850. That must have had a massive impact on the social fabric of the country.
Oh, it was a period of huge change. So many immigrants arriving with different skills, different perspectives. It definitely fueled economic growth, helped diversify the economy.
Right.
But of course, you also have tensions, social divisions. Different groups are competing for resources, opportunities.
Makes sense.
And it reminds us that Canada's story is so intertwined with the stories of people who came from somewhere else, seeking a new life, helping to create that mosaic that we associate with Canada today.
Right. It's this constant tension between holding on to what's familiar and embracing something new.
Yeah.
And all of this is happening while Canada is pushing westward, expanding its territory.
Exactly. Think about it. The fur trade was still going strong. Gold was discovered. The dream of a transcontinental railway was starting to take shape. All these forces pushing Canada westward.
Right.
But, and this is important, that westward expansion came at a cost, especially for Indigenous communities. More displacement, more pressure to assimilate. It's a complicated, often dark chapter in Canadian history. And it still has an impact on the relationship between the Canadian government and Indigenous peoples today.
You're right. It shows that progress can be messy, can have unintended consequences.
For sure.
And sometimes achieving national unity means, facing some uncomfortable truths, acknowledging past wrongs. Speaking of unity, how did we go from, this patchwork of colonies to the Canada we know now?
Well, the idea of a unified Canada, it really gained traction in the mid-1800s. The document mentions the Charlottetown and Quebec conferences.
Oh, yeah.
1864, delegates from all these different colonies get together to hammer out a plan for Confederation.
So those conferences were like the brainstorming sessions for a brand new country.
Exactly. They were figuring out the blueprint,
What were the main reasons behind this push for unification? I mean, why did they want to come together?
Well, there were lots of different motivations. Some wanted more autonomy within the British Empire. Others were worried about, potential threats from the United States. Some saw it as a chance for economic growth, expansion. And others were driven by this idea of a stronger, more united nation on the world stage. It was complicated, for sure. Lots of political, economic, social factors all coming together to eventually create the Dominion of Canada.
And just 3 years later, in 1867, it happened. The Dominion of Canada was born. I mean, that's a pretty quick turnaround from conference table to an entire country.
It really is. It shows how dedicated and visionary those early leaders were. They knew they needed to forge a new path, one that balanced the interests of all these different regions and created a foundation for a nation that could, meet the challenges ahead. But of course, it doesn't stop there. That was just the start of another chapter.
Right. So now we're into the 20th century.
A whole new century.
And one thing that really jumps out from the document is the Canadian Pacific Railway. That iconic ribbon of steel that connected east to west.
Oh, yeah, the CPR, a massive accomplishment, a real testament to Canada's ambition.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just about physically connecting the country, It was about connecting it economically, culturally, opening up the West for settlement, trade. It's crucial to remember that this progress, it didn't come without a cost, especially for Indigenous communities. Their lands were often disrupted, their ways of life threatened. It's a complex legacy, and it's something that continues to affect the relationship between Canada and Indigenous peoples.
Yeah, that theme again. Progress and its unintended consequences.
It keeps coming up.
It does. The document also talks about the Indian Act of 1876. It imposed this system of governance control over Indigenous peoples, took away even more of their autonomy, their right to self-determination.
Yeah, the Indian Act was part of this whole assimilationist policy, trying to force Indigenous peoples to integrate into Canadian society, often in ways that were really harmful, culturally destructive.
Right.
And this period also saw the residential school system, taking Indigenous children away from their families, their communities, the trauma, the cultural disruption. It's a really dark chapter in Canadian history, and it's something that we're still trying to come to terms with today.
It's heartbreaking to think about all the injustices that Indigenous communities have faced. And while this was all happening within Canada, the world outside was changing too.
Oh, yeah.
The early 20th century, you've got two world wars, and both of them had a huge impact on Canada. World War I, Canada earned this international reputation for its military strength, especially after Vimy Ridge.
A defining moment.
But that participation also exposed some divisions within Canada. Conscription became this really contentious issue, particularly in Quebec.
It definitely did.
It's fascinating how these global events, they ripple inward, right? They shape a nation's identity, highlight those internal dynamics that are always there. And in the middle of all of this, Canada's going through social changes too. The women's suffrage movement is gaining momentum. The document mentions Agnes MacPhail becoming the first woman elected to Parliament in 1921. What a moment.
It really was. Agnes MacPhail's election, it was a victory for all the women who fought so hard for the right to vote, to participate in politics.
Yeah.
A turning point in the struggle for gender equality in Canada.
It's a reminder that progress can happen even when things feel chaotic, Even in times of global upheaval, the fight for social justice continues.
Always does.
And talking about political milestones, the document also mentions the Statute of Westminster in 1931. That gave Canada even more autonomy within the British Commonwealth.
A big step toward full sovereignty. It recognized Canada as an equal partner within the Commonwealth, Canada had the right to make its own laws, govern its own affairs, no more interference from Britain.
Right.
It was crucial in the evolution of Canada's relationship with, its former colonial power.
So you've got women getting the right to vote, Canada asserting its independence within the Commonwealth. It seems like things are moving in a more progressive direction. And then, bam, the Great Depression.
Oh, yeah.
The world is in economic freefall.
Tough times.
How did Canada handle it?
The Great Depression, it really tested Canadians. I mean, unemployment was through the roof. Businesses were failing left and right. Families everywhere were struggling.
I can imagine.
The document even mentions Bennett Duggies, those makeshift vehicles that people made because they couldn't afford cars anymore. It's a symbol of that hardship, but also the ingenuity of Canadians.
It's true. It shows that even when there's progress and prosperity, unexpected challenges can pop up and force you to get creative. And unfortunately, that break from economic hardship, it didn't last long. World War II hits, and the world's at war again.
Another global conflict.
Canada stepped up, didn't it?
Oh, big time. Canada's contributions to the Allied effort in World War II, they were significant. Militarily, economically, the Battle of the Atlantic, for example.
Yeah.
Canadian naval forces were crucial in protecting those supply lines. And then the liberation of Europe, Canadian soldiers were right there on the front lines.
Brave.
Incredibly brave.
The document mentions the Battle of the Atlantic being particularly brutal. Those Canadian ships constantly under threat from German U-boats. It must have been terrifying.
It was a grueling campaign.
Yeah.
And Canada's role in keeping those supply lines open, it was essential to the Allied victory.
Wow.
But the war also had its dark moments, sadly. The internment of Japanese Canadians. It's a shameful chapter rooted in fear and prejudice.
It's a reminder that even when a country feels united, even when everyone's working towards a common goal, we can still make terrible mistakes, driven by fear, by intolerance.
It's true.
The internment of Japanese Canadians, it's a warning, a reminder to always uphold the rights of all citizens, no matter their background.
Absolutely. And as the war ended, Canada came out of it with this renewed sense of purpose, this commitment to building a better world. The post-war era, you see the expansion of social welfare programs, universal health care, for example. There's this growing belief in social justice, creating a more equitable society.
And in 1949, Newfoundland and Labrador joined Confederation.
Right. Completing the map of Canada as we know it today.
Amazing. When you think about how much Canada accomplished in just the first half of the 20th century, coast to coast, but I bet the second half had even more in store.
You bet it did. The second half of the 20th century, well, you see Canada navigating the Cold War, grappling with national unity, embracing multiculturalism in a whole new way. It's a period of immense change, and it continues to shape Canada today.
All right, so here we are. Second half of the 20th century, world's a whole new ballgame, right? The Cold War's going on, Canada's trying to figure out its place in all of this. And, one thing the document mentions is Canada's focus on peacekeeping during this time. Really interesting, isn't it?
It is. It really shows how Canada's priorities had shifted. After World War II, there's this strong belief in multilateralism, working together to prevent conflict.
Yeah.
Peacekeeping became like a central part of Canada's role on the world stage.
Right.
And, Lester B. Pearson, he became prime minister later on.
Oh, yeah.
But even before that, he was instrumental in setting up the first UN peacekeeping force during the Suez Crisis.
Wow.
1956. And he actually won the Nobel Peace Prize for his work on that.
That's amazing.
It says a lot about how dedicated Canada was to international diplomacy.
It really does. It's kind of incredible to think that a relatively young country like Canada could have such a big impact globally.
Yeah.
But while all this was happening, Canada was dealing with its own internal issues too, right? The rise of Quebec nationalism.
Oh, yeah, that was a big one. The Quiet Revolution in Quebec, the 60s. So much change happening socially, culturally, politically. There was this growing sense of Quebecois identity, and a lot of people wanted more autonomy within Canada. Some even wanted full-on independence.
Right.
And that led to some pretty intense debates, even some violent confrontations. The October Crisis in 1970, for example, that really brought the whole issue of Quebec separatism to the forefront.
The October Crisis, that must have been a really scary time. I mean, the document talks about a British diplomat being kidnapped. A Quebec cabinet minister, too. The army was deployed on the streets of Montreal. It sounds like the country was teetering on the edge.
It was a tense time, for sure. It really highlighted how fragile national unity can be, and how difficult it is to balance all these different aspirations within a federal system.
Yeah, it's a tough balancing act. And then there are those two referendums on Quebec sovereignty, 1980 and 1995.
Oh, yeah, I remember those. The whole country was holding its breath.
Right, those are nail-biters. I mean, they were so close.
They were incredibly divisive. It forced Canadians to really think about what it meant to be Canadian. What did self-determination really mean? What was the future of the country? And the fact that the nice side won by such a small margin, it just shows how deep those divisions ran.
Yeah, it shows that creating a truly unified country, it's an ongoing process. It takes a lot of work. You need empathy, compromise, and an willingness to really listen to each other, even when you disagree.
Couldn't agree more.
And, while we're talking about different perspectives, this period also saw Canada embracing multiculturalism in a bigger way than ever before.
Right. The 1970s, multiculturalism became official policy. It was a huge shift for Canada. It was about recognizing that Canada's strength was in its diversity, that embracing different cultures, different traditions would make Canada richer, stronger. And it reflected how Canada's demographics were changing, with more and more immigrants arriving from all over the world.
It's that image of Canada that a lot of people have, this mosaic of cultures, everyone contributing to the bigger picture. Has it always been easy, though? I mean, has multiculturalism always worked perfectly?
It's been a journey, for sure. Integrating newcomers from all over the world, it presents challenges. Language barriers, employment discrimination, finding affordable housing, making sure people feel like they belong.
Right.
And there's always that discussion, that debate about how to balance preserving cultural identity with, promoting shared Canadian values.
Yeah.
It's complex. No easy answers. But it's something Canada continues to work on, trying to create a truly inclusive society for everyone.
It's a good reminder that building a truly fair and equitable society, it takes ongoing effort. You've got to constantly be challenging prejudice and discrimination.
Absolutely.
And while all these social and cultural changes were happening, Canada was also going through this big constitutional shakeup.
You're talking about the patriation of the Constitution in 1982.
Yeah. landmark moment, bringing the Constitution home from Britain.
Right. Made Canada fully sovereign in terms of its own constitution.
Right.
And even more importantly, it brought in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, fundamental rights for all Canadians.
The Charter of Rights and Freedoms, it's become such a cornerstone of what it means to be Canadian, hasn't it?
It has. It's given individuals the power to challenge laws and policies that are discriminatory. It's made people more aware of their rights. And it's sparked some pretty important legal battles over issues like same-sex marriage, abortion, language rights, all these big conversations about social justice, the changing values of Canadian society.
And speaking of same-sex marriage, Canada was a leader there too, wasn't it? Legalizing it nationwide in 2005.
A big moment. It was a bold statement about equality and the rights of LGBTQ plus Canadians. It definitely inspired similar movements around the world.
It's been quite a journey, hasn't it? I mean, we've covered so much, from ancient indigenous civilizations to the arrival of Europeans, from colonial struggles to Confederation, 2 world wars, peacekeeping missions, constitutional debates. It's amazing how much Canada has gone through, how much it's changed and evolved. What's the one thing that stands out to you the most from all of this?
Honestly, it's the resilience. The resilience of Canada and Canadians. Throughout history, this country has faced so many obstacles. Conflicts, economic turmoil, social divisions, trying to balance the needs of all these different regions and cultures. And through it all, Canada's found a way to adapt, to innovate, to come out stronger.
It's impressive.
It really is. It says a lot about the spirit of the people, that belief in building a better future.
I totally agree. And as we wrap up this deep dive into Canadian history, I think it's important to remember that the story doesn't end here. Canada is still evolving, still figuring things out, and the decisions we make today, they're going to shape the country for generations to come.
No doubt about it. Climate change, reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, economic inequality, figuring out how to navigate this increasingly complex world. These are the challenges Canada faces now.
Big challenges.
They are. But if history has taught us anything, it's that Canada has what it takes to face these challenges head on, to learn from the past and keep moving forward, keep striving to be a more just, equitable, and sustainable nation.
Well said. Thanks for joining me on this incredible journey through Canadian history.
My pleasure.
And to everyone listening, remember that history isn't just something in a textbook. It's alive. It's all around us. It shapes who we are, and it affects the choices we make. So stay curious, keep exploring, and never stop asking questions about the world and how we got here.